same anti-Russian perspective. It seems like the Democratic Party is really jumping on this bandwagon as opposed to not looking at voter suppression or their own policies is the problem. So I think the panel should talk about how we're going to deal with that issue. It's going to be really difficult. That's obviously splitting our movement. The other question, I think, obviously, is that our movement is, obviously the ruling class has really learned the lessons from Vietnam. And of course, they stopped the draft, even though they may want to bring it up again. But they did stop the draft. And they also created a situation where they created a false flag operation, which was 9/11. And of course, 9/11 was the basis of the wars that exist today, the war on terror. And so it's obviously, they didn't need the draft. They used this operation to motivate the American public to go into war. It's a volunteer army. And of course, someone would argue that it's also an economic draft army, but it's nevertheless a volunteer army. And it's something that we have to address also, the question of the war on terror, whether or not it's valid or not. And it's clearly, anyone who's been involved in this knows that the 9/11 movement was basically, 9/11 incident was basically a false flag operation, just like the Maine, to get us into a war.
Okay,
so how do we respond to that?
That's a lot. Let's hear from our panelists.
And then we'll get to the next person. Alice?
Yeah, I want to talk about the Russian bashing because I had it in my talk, but I didn't get to it. Just to think about our history, I think we have to communicate. Starting in 1918, Wilson sent troops to help the Tsar against the peasants. Stalin asked Truman to turn the bomb over the UN, and we made the conditions so onerous where we would have a veto and control that he said the hell with it and made his own bomb. Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik. Gorbachev said, let's get rid of all the nuclear weapons. Reagan said, great idea. Gorbachev said, you can't do Star Wars. Reagan says, I'm not taking Star Wars off the table, and that was the end of that. We promised Gorbachev that if they didn't object to a united Germany going into NATO, that we would not expand NATO. They lost 27 million people to the Nazi onslaught, and we now have NATO troops on their border. I mean, how would we feel if they had troops in Mexico or Canada? We know what happened when they went to Cuba. We almost had World War III. And the deal that Kennedy made with Khrushchev was if they got the missiles out of Cuba, we would take ours out of Turkey. That was secret because nobody in America would let Kennedy make that deal, but he made it secretly. And they took the missiles out of Turkey, and they're back. Then Clinton bombed Kosovo, first time a UN war without the approval of the Security Council. Russia vetoed it. And here's a quote from Clinton. If we're going to have a strong economic relationship that includes our ability to sell around the world, Europe has got to be a key. That's what this Kosovo thing is about. He was quoted saying that in The Nation. Then Putin proposed in 2000 to Clinton, let's cut our arsenals. Then they were like around 10,000 each. Let's each go to 1,000. But don't go ahead with that ballistic missile defense system you're planning. And Clinton said, forget it, I'm not doing that. And Bush walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty that we had with them since 72. 2008, nobody knows this, and in 2015, China and Russia proposed a treaty to keep weapons out of space. And we blocked it in the committee. That's our military. We actually blocked a proposal to talk about not having a space weapons race. And then after we attacked and boasted about the virus, the Stuxnet virus that we did with Israel on Iran's enrichment, we boasted about it. Russia came back and said, hey, why don't we do a treaty to ban cyber war? We said, forget it. So they're under siege by us. I mean, and if Putin, who was the head of the Russian KGB, wanted to hack our elections, he wouldn't have used a Russian computer expert. I mean, he would have done it from, Georgia or Alabama or something. So anyway.
Thank you, Alice.
But the point is to just think about this, that there's answers and that this is ridiculous what they're doing.
I just want to add that in a few weeks I'm going to go to Russia, and if they let me back in this country, I'm going to talk about our meetings there with Gorbachev and everybody else that we're able to meet with. And I highly recommend, groups are starting up these exchanges again, as during the last Cold War, and it's very important. And just quickly, if you're going to look for problems with the U.S. election, right? The documented, indisputable facts that the loser of the popular vote is in the White House, threatened intimidation of the polls, had state secretaries of state strip people off the rolls, fought the counting of paper ballots where they existed. I mean, there's 18 legitimate, indisputable reasons why that election is no good, and the only one that the Democrats care about is the one that we haven't seen any evidence for, but allows the blaming of a nuclear-armed government risking World War III. If you're going to go after Donald Trump, here's a guy writing unconstitutional laws every day. Here's a guy who's violating the domestic and the foreign emoluments clauses from day one. The argument that we put up at impeachdonaldtrumpnow.org says not one word about Russia because it sticks to things that are proven. But nobody cares about proven reasons to impeach Donald Trump if they aren't anti-Russian, anti-Putin reasons that allow the claim that Hillary Clinton would have won the election without foreign interference. And never mind if it kills us all. So there are easy solutions for better avenues to take. We just have to get off the Putin derangement syndrome. There have been a lot of hands. So 1, 2, 3.
Hi, thanks very much for the panel. My name is Mitchell Cohen, and the panel has been fantastic, and I wish you could each expand on what you were saying. And especially, I'd like to hear Glenn continue in the pages that you waved that I won't have time to answer this. I think it's really important what each of us does. Let's talk about the flip side of what the government is doing. Let's talk about what we can do a little bit. Just the chants at all the marches are no ban, no wall. Just each of us started adding no war, so it becomes no ban, no wall, no war. And I started doing that. It's easy to do. People pick it up instantly. Doesn't take a leap, and people just are there. The only reason why it's difficult to do is because the Democrats are trying to control the marches, and the Democrats are all lined up for the war. Schumer, Clinton, all of them. But people instantly pick that up. And so if each of us just start doing that during the marches, I'm sure we're all going to them, that's one good thing. I wanted to point one other thing out. A few blocks away at the New School, back in 1990 and 91, before the Gulf War, there was a student there named Sam Lewin who became a resistor. He was in the military, and he was resisting being sent to Iraq at the time, and to Kuwait. And by himself, he didn't know what to do. And the students in his class, undergraduates, got together. I was at some of those meetings, maybe 10 people, 15 people, and said, we support Sam, and hands off Sam. And pretty soon this became a national movement called Hands Off. It got abbreviated to support all resistors inside the military who wanted to resist and who were trying to resist. Sam was then empowered to go back, and he organized his whole platoon up in the Bronx to resist. A lot of people of color, mostly. People who don't know about this anymore, don't remember it, but during the Gulf War, there were more resistors at that time per capita than there were in the Vietnam War, which had a lot, including the fragging that was going on and that helped end the Vietnam War as well. So just little groups of people, 2 and 3 people here, support people who are resisting, help them organize that resistance. People are going to armories and giving out flyers and talking to people. Been going on for a couple of years now. And that's things that we can do that are really important and I think would have a profound effect on the ability of this government to wage wars around the world.
Very good. Let's take 2 more questions that I already pointed out. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I was listening very carefully to the history of war resistance, but I believe that there's another side of the coin. Why is war being fought? Who is the real enemy when it comes to having wars? And nobody in this panel discussed it. Nobody dealt with it at all. Because if we don't know who the real enemy is, then all the war-resistant elements is reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. And I would like to ask the panel, do you have any ideas of who the real enemy is?
Thanks. Let's take 1 more question and then we'll try to answer all those. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you, everyone, to panelists for today. So I have 2 questions, and they relate to understanding better how Martin Luther King Jr.'s anti-war politics, or understanding his anti-war politics better, and also how they relate to some of the things that were said today on the panel. So one question is, did Martin Luther King Jr.'s anti-war politic include an anti-imperialism beyond anti-US imperialism, such as recognizing the imperialism of Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc.? And then 2, how did or how does Martin Luther King Jr.'s anti-imperialist values relate to social justice in the countries I mentioned, plus Syria, Libya, China? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those 2. Thank you.
Anybody want to go first?
There's sides to that question. I've never heard of Dr. King denouncing Iranian imperialism. I'm not aware of that having existed for a couple of thousands of years either. But Dr. King felt, and he said so, that a person's primary responsibility is to do a critique of one's own government. That is the first obligation of the citizen. But he quite clearly understood that there was one imperialism in the world that was responsible for being the biggest purveyor of violence in the world. That imperialism, if that's what you're going to call it, that great power was the United States. There was no need, he felt no need to denounce a Soviet Union that was not committing nearly as much violence as the United States, his country, whose politics he could have some effect on. So I don't know where you're going with your question about the failings of Dr. Martin Luther King to sufficiently denounce Iran, which at that time was under a Shah who had been installed by the United States. And one could say that was really the United States too, whatever Iran was guilty of.
Anybody else? If not, I just add that Martin Luther King in that speech 50 years ago tomorrow did begin by saying to the predictable critics, I am not painting as paragons of virtue other nations, governments, and forces that commit their own sins, but as Glenn said, I'm dealing with the biggest purveyor of violence on earth as his responsibility. He also said, I've had this additional responsibility put on me of having been given a Nobel Peace Prize. She sort of admitted that he hadn't actually earned yet, but he was going to earn it. Damn it. And so decades later, the Nobel Committee sees a black man put in the White House and said, here's another guy who hasn't earned a Nobel Peace Prize yet. Let's give him one and see what happens. And one might have predicted what was going to happen. They got the first pro-war Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, and the only one to denounce a previous laureate, namely Martin Luther King Jr. in terms of this question of why in the world we will not say who it is who wants war and benefits from war and gives us war, maybe we're just giving the wrong answer. But when I said it is the weapons that come first, and the weapons profiteers are openly talking now, shamelessly, unlike the period after World War I, where weapons profiteering was considered shameless and shameful and disreputable. It is now openly discussed. We got to have more wars to sell more weapons. When I went in War is a Lie through all the types of lies used for wars, I then went to the obvious next question, well, then what's the truth? Why do people want to create wars? And I looked at the weapons profiteering, at the political calculations, at the power hunger, and concluded in the end that you could give all the rational explanations and you still needed insanity to explain the creation of these wars. It really is a madness, as Dr. King said.
I want to speak to a couple of the things that were said. I guess I'll maybe pick up from where David ended. I live in southeastern Connecticut, the submarine capital of the world. And I was active with the Community for Nonviolent Action that moved there in 1960, or went there to oppose the building of the Polaris submarine system. I moved there in 1976 to protest the Trident submarine system, and now we are going into this third phase of building more and more submarines for the next 30 years as part of this multi-billion-dollar effort. And so I see General Dynamics being responsible. I see the local politicians, no matter how liberal they are all for those submarines. And the people, and the fact that there's no support for any alternative, and so basically all the people in my community are about kind of, build these subs. When there was a massive layoff after the end of the Cold War as part of the peace dividend, the call was save our state, save our subs. That we're so identified, and we are only one of hundreds of communities around the country so identified with the need to build these weapons. And so all of these ridiculous excuses are developed as to why we really need them, but really it's a jobs program that's very inefficient, so it becomes a corporate profit program. And so as somebody who's done economic conversion, it's difficult because you are in the belly of the beast when you are trying to come up with those alternatives. So maybe that's a segue to the next thing in terms of, I'm glad you brought up Sam Lewin, because I think that whether it be opposing the buildup of nuclear weapons or supporting war resistors, we need both what's happening in the local communities as well as kind of that national level of coordination. I met Sam because he came to the War Resistors League, because Michael Marsh, who was on staff, did a lot of support for those resistors, as WRL has been doing, and as I said before. So I think the marches are not going to be enough. We're going into very, very hard times. I mean, as somebody who's a nonviolence trainer, you might have guessed that by how many times I talked about other trainers who were resistors. We're getting lots of calls. I'm very heartened by that. We're getting lots of requests. We just did a training for trainers up in New England with War Resistors League. We're doing work on expanding our website because there's just such a response out there. But one of the things that bothers me is there's a lot of people who have no idea how nonviolent social change has ever happened. So the demonstrations are just not enough. We need movements are made of campaigns and events, not just events, not just demonstrations. So we've got to get serious about how do we both support the grassroots with levels of skills and education, tools, ideas, tactics, but then also how do we kind of coordinate with one another. And we're really, and here obviously I'm talking about the grassroots, I'm not talking about the Democratic Party, no matter how much they try to kind of take some credit. I think they actually want a lot of distance from a lot of the stuff we're doing, and I'm happy with as much distance as we can get. So I think there's really that coordinated effort of building up the grassroots and kind of understanding how change has happened and how we have to be, I'm not even sure what the next campaign is. I just know that people need the skills to be able to do it and be able to get past just doing demonstrations, not to say we don't do them, but there has to be more than that.
Go ahead.
I love my idea for the next campaign. She says modestly, you know, there's all the sports with the football champions and the baseball. Why don't we have a World Energy Series? Like Jerry Brown saying great stuff in California. You know, why doesn't New York compete? You know, there's millions of jobs. There's millions of jobs. They're clean. The planet's dying. We can't forget it. I mean, war is terrible, but, you know, that's we all have to. Those are the two existential crises, the climate and blowing ourselves up with nuclear weapons, you know. So, and I just want to say, New York City, we are so blessed because we have like the Saudi Arabia of wind, and we have a very shallow seabed that goes out over the horizon, so you don't even have to look at the windmills. You know, they were hysterical up in Massachusetts. I sort of relate because I like to see the horizon. Well, we don't
Long
even...
Island's a successful wind power now, though.
Just, yeah, like one little thing, but we need to do, you know, I don't know where de Blasio is. I mean, why? Cuomo wants to give $7.5 billion in subsidies to nuclear power. You could put a solar roof on every house in New York State for that price, you know, or insulate every bit, whatever. Anyway, I think there's really a hopeful thing here, you know, with the energy. That's really something we could do that would put everybody to work, that would help the planet, and that wouldn't make war. You know, you wouldn't... We spend $50 billion a year in peacetime to protect the oil tankers that were going back and forth.
Let's get just a few more questions if we have them, and then try to wrap up. So yeah, 1, 2, 3. Perfect.
I'm going to read these words so that you can comment, because this day should not go by without this. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwanted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Who in our government seeks out the influences of the military-industrial complex?
Good. Hold on. 2 more questions. 2 more questions.
You talked about military-industrial complex, but I call it the military-industrial educational complex. And I want to know how any of the panelists get the message that peace is not the way, an anti-war message to schools, to high schools especially, where the recruiters are hanging out, engaging young people to be the next level in the military. Trump wants to increase the military, the Department of Defense, and the troops with the tax cuts and getting the taxes for war. How do we get this to our kids, to our students that have to know that peace is the way?
Good. 1 more.
Let's make it the military-industrial educational media complex.
There it is, I would say that.
I have heard, and I have not heard this anywhere in mainstream media, that Putin is reducing the Russian military budget by 25%. This has, as far as I can tell, not been reported here at all, while Mr. What's his name wants to put it up $54 billion more here. So what's with our media?
Yeah, it is the media.
Can we maybe have some concluding remarks from each person up here? You want to start down there with Glenn and come this way with Deborah?
Oh, I feel kind of a little bit disconnected because I don't have anything to report about keeping these recruiters out of schools.
Right, you gotta do it.
I don't even have any connection to education. But I wanted to talk about this. The gentleman talked about the war on terror, and if we're talking about fake news, this may be the fakest news of the 21st century. The United States and Saudi Arabia created something that never had existed on the face of the earth. There have always been folks that you could describe as jihadists or takfiris, but there had never been an international jihadist network until the U.S. and the Saudis, with the help of Zia al-Haq in Pakistan, created the international jihadist network to not to fight the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, but to defeat the leftist government that had overthrown a king in Afghanistan, and who had sent cadres out into the hinterlands away from Kabul on missions of land reform and education of women and all these things that left progressive Americans claim that they're for, and they were arriving with their heads were being sent back to Kabul. Zbigniew Brzezinski brags that that helping to make the Mujahideen, who were just the most backward elements of warlords and feudal landowners back then, into a viable military force, would bring the Russians into the Soviets, into Afghanistan, that was the bait to get them embroiled in their morass. So the jihadist network, international jihadist network, was created not even against the Soviets. It was created in order to undermine and subvert a secular leftist regime. And they have built it up ever since, to the point that in the Muslim world, that is the only way that the United States is able to project power, because there is no social base in that part of the world for U.S. Policy. So they have to kind of hijack a very reactionary base of Wahhabism, which is why that they're in a partnership with the Saudis. So this whole war on terror it revolves around a U.S. war-making invention, a social base that they nurtured in collaboration with the Saudis in order to make war against secular regimes. And everything that we've seen has flowed from that. I believe that the great crisis that they now face, and there are many, in Syria and Iraq, is that although these Islamic jihadists are quite reactionary, their movement behaves in many ways like a nationalism, and sometimes is intertwined with nationalisms, and therefore has contradictions with imperialism. Imperialism seeks to abolish everybody's claim to sovereignty, national sovereignty, or any religious kind of ummah claim to something like a sovereignty. The imperialism wants to obliterate all sovereignties except its own. And so there are real contradictions between these jihadists that the United States has empowered and armed and trained, and U.S. imperialism. And that is expressed in ISIS. That's where that crisis comes from. And that's why ISIS is the rogue of their cultivated jihadists.
I think we have to look at what we can do, because actually this thing is falling apart. I mean, the fact that everybody showed up at the airport was so incredible. It wasn't even organized. Like, there's a new energy. What was going on in the UN last week, it was like a miracle that they were. And I think one of the things that we can do from our perspective in the empire is the divestment campaigns. Once they say this June that nuclear weapons are illegal, you can go to your school pension and your school, and your city pensions and your and say they're illegal, because they were trying to do it in Europe. They did it with chemical and biological weapons, but the banks say, well, they're not illegal. So that's one good thing of getting them illegal. It's not like just because they're illegal we're going to get rid of them, but we can start making a dent in like divestment campaigns. We should definitely look for that, because you quoted Eisenhower, and by the way, part of that speech, besides military-industrial complex, he talked about the academic establishment that's in cahoots with them. You know, he named all of it. So I think we have to make our impact as Americans living here on the military-industrial complex, and divestment is a good way to start.
Wow. So I think that, I hope that part of what I got across here is that we in the peace movement sometimes think that people who join the military, they're different from us. They can kill. Well, they can't either, not without consequences. And I think that some of our, closest allies should be those kids that are at risk for recruitment. I don't use the terminology of an all-volunteer military. I try to talk about an all-recruited military, because that's what they are. And some of the service members can absolutely be some of our closest allies in this movement. Obama dropped 26,000 bombs in 8 years. Trump is already, on track to have his tenure see more bombs dropped than that. The generals and the CIA have greater authority to conduct strikes without his permission. The Obama rule of not dropping bombs unless there was near certainty, whatever the heck that means, that civilians wouldn't be killed, is gone, and we saw the effects of that in Mosul. And so then that translates to the reality for people's lives, obviously the civilians and the others who are killed on our, quote unquote opponent's side, but then the folks that, that are, members of the United States community, not all citizens, but people who fight on the side of the United States. And these kids who are joining, because I talk to them every day, they're not joining because they're choosing to kill. They're joining because they're thinking they're going to do something better than themselves and access something better than themselves. And because of this increased, absolutely, 20 veterans a day, 1 active duty service member a day. Service members have killed themselves in higher numbers than ISIS has killed any U.S. service member. That is the truth of the matter, and that has been true in every year that we've counted since 2010. U.S. service members took their own lives, active duty, then died in combat. A recruiter's quota in general is 2 individuals a month. To recruit 2 individuals a month, we have billions of dollars dedicated to the recruiting budget. So I think we need an honest and transparent and open discussion of what it really means to support the troops. Not only is Trump cutting, human services in the civilian sector, but part of his bloated DOD budget actually includes cuts to DOD health care. So when you have drone pilots being asked to kill more civilians, when you have more boots on the ground, when you have increased focus on militarization and decreased focus on diplomacy, that is inevitably going to result in more trauma experienced by service members, more folks coming home and hopefully being mobilized into, the peace and justice movement. Everybody has in every school district an inherent right for equal access, for an alternative to the recruiter sales pitch. But our experience when I was in New Mexico was that DOD was watching what we were doing, and DOD shut us down at the state level. So you have to persevere. I believe New York has equal access 1 and guaranteed. I mean, it's there. It exists in court decisions, but we need to get veterans into the classroom. We need to have an honest and open discussion of how military life affects not just the people that we call our opponents, but also the people, who we call our troops, our own troops. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, one of the things that I've done a lot of in the last 20 years is go into the schools. Through War Resisters League, we've developed a lot of counter-recruitment materials over the years, and my own son got very interested in this, and so that got me into the first school I got into. The military is there every week, the Navy one week, the Army the next, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that, and it continues, War Resisters League has a lot of material from kind of the It's not just a job, it's 8 years of your life, which is intense, but now we're putting out POM cards, and we're working with the National Network Opposed to Militarization of Youth. And so there's much more of an effort to kind of say, okay, here's materials, let's really get it out there, do more of a kind of campaign to really get that kind of stuff out there. So I think that that's really important, and I'm hoping that there'll be an increased interest in people going into the schools, because as Maria said, they have a multi-billion-dollar budget just to do that kind of recruiting, and for us to just kind of find the volunteers to get in the schools. And I think, I didn't want to just be one of the gray-haired old ladies there, so I worked with developing relationships with the kids, giving support to a youth peace group. My job was to train the kids to do the kind of recruitment, not for me to be part of the older crowd going in. And then we would take them out of the school and do weekends at Voluntown, the old Community for Nonviolent Action, where we could give them even more radical education than we could in the classroom. To me, I've always kind of felt like going into the classroom, you're watched and it's difficult. Being in the hallways, in that kind of equal access, or getting the kids out of the school and doing that education, you can really give them much more of a sense of their own empowerment, which they don't always have in the schools. And then also just, I think, around the military-industrial complex, education, media. To go back to what I had said about particularly the World War II resistors and the level of constructive program they did, right? We wouldn't have Democracy Now! All over the country necessarily if it wasn't for Roy Kepler, who said, oh, let's start an alternative media radio station, right? And I remember at the right after 9/11, people would say, how do you get our news? And Democracy Now! Was on about 8 stations at that time. It's hundreds and hundreds now. I don't even know what the number is. But that's just an example of when there's a need and an ability to kind of fill it, that we need to be there. So we need to be looking more and more at all of these areas. I did economic conversion work 30 years ago, and when we talk about alternative energy, people, there weren't enough models in this country. Now there are. Now it's real, so now we can. General Dynamics is never going to, convert. That's not the job. That's not my job as an organizer. It's to begin to develop the other jobs in real community economic development, because most people don't want to build submarines once they really understand what they're doing. They don't want to work for those kind of corporations, but they're stuck because there's not a whole lot of other jobs in a lot of those, particularly engineering areas, or in working class kind of, go into the yard with only a high school education. So we need to keep working on those alternatives.
Very quickly, yes, Russia has cut its military spending from about $70 billion US 3 years ago to $48 billion US now. To put that in some perspective, there are about 20 countries on Earth that spend over $10 billion a year on militarism. 9 of them are in NATO. Another 8 are allies of the United States. The other 3, including Russia and China and Iran, are potential U.S. allies if the U.S. took a very different approach to the world. But that one demonized force of global evil out there, Russia, has cut its military spending of part of its sinister plot of world domination down to $48 billion, while the United States is well over $700 billion a year, with dramatic increases planned, and not counting secret budgets, and not counting all sorts of other military spending and interest on military debt and so forth. So there never before has been the sort of thing as the U.S. military and the expense involved, with the records set by Barack Obama and likely to be shattered by Donald Trump if we don't stop him. But it's not a Department of Defense, no matter what they call it. There is nothing defensive about it. And it certainly is not defending democracy to spend that kind of money on this criminal enterprise when the public is dramatically against it and in favor of huge cuts to the military, not huge increases to the military. On the military-industrial complex, I think it is worth noting that if you read that whole speech by President Eisenhower on his day out the door, he blames Russia for all of it. All right, read the whole speech. And Eisenhower knew. Before he became president, he gave an even better speech on the same topic. It's not like he found this out and it just happened. It happened significantly because of World War I. World War I, years and years before, the veterans of which were attacked in the streets of Washington, D.C. with chemical weapons by the future heroes of World War II. This is when the military-industrial complex got its foothold. This is when taxes got their foothold, right? Which came first? The weapons or the wars or the taxes? The weapons, and then the wars, and then the taxes, which were supposed to go away. And if you love World War II and you're not fond of taxes, you got a real problem. Right? Because ordinary people weren't taxed until World War II. And it's never stopped. It's never gone away. The troops have never left Germany or Japan, and the military-industrial complex has never shut down, and World War II rolls on and on. I think on the counter-recruitment question, one thing you can do is get the military tests out of the schools.
Right.
Another thing you can do is get the ability for students to know that they are military tests and to opt out of the military tests and to allow parents to exercise their legal right to opt out from having their kids' information and contact information given to the military. There's one state, Maryland, that on a form that it sends to parents, a mandatory form that the parents all have to check things on, they include a box for do you want to opt out from having all your kids' information sent to the U.S. military. In the other 49 states, the parents have to go out of their way, right? So, an organization that Joanne mentioned, can help you work on getting these kinds of laws passed in your county or city or state. Go to studentprivacy.org. Get a new book on counter-recruitment by Pat Elder that is excellent. And get the videos made by the Veterans for Peace chapter in the United Kingdom with the toy action figures, the PTSD Action Man and the destroyed veterans action figures that are quite powerful. Show the video of this event. Teach the books and writings of these people. Get into students' heads with other ideas. Finally, I would say that we need, if we're going to envision a world beyond war, we have to give people, what seem like outlandish fantasies that we don't even dare imagine, but are absolutely real and existent. I came up here on a train that, I was lucky it stayed on the tracks, but it was hours and hours of rolling through, devastated towns to get here, while in Copenhagen, Denmark, they just decided to build a new power plant, and rather than put it far away, they put it right next to downtown and made it so clean that it's got the cleanest air, cleaner than the other air around it, and put a ski slope on top of the power plant so that you can go to the top of the power plant, breathe the clean mountain air of the electricity production, and ski down the thing. And we're lucky if the trains stay on the goddamn track. Right? This is the difference. Right? It's not just a power plant. It's free college. It's free preschool. It's free top quality education from preschool through college. It's retirement. It's vacation. It's health care. It's everything you dare dream of, guaranteed as a human right for slightly higher taxes, but none of the fees, none of the debts, none of the co-pays, and none of the wars. Right? This is the choice. The places with the greater lifespans, the greater happiness, the greater security in a real sense of that word, do not have the level of military spending. They don't have the same level of billionaires hoarding wealth, but they, far more importantly, in a question of funds that dwarfs the money hoarded by the billionaires, they do not have this dumping of an unfathomable sum into military spending every year. So if you want to imagine a world beyond war, look around. Look at the things the rest of the world is dreaming up and doing, and then start daring to think that the United States could have a few of those things too. Thank you all for coming out here.
Better